Knowledge has always been power, and control over it, authority. In 1559, the Vatican created a tool that for 400 years defined the boundaries of what was permissible in the Catholic world. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Prohibited Books, became a kind of anti-canon of European culture, a list of works whose reading threatened believers with excommunication from the Church. This list, born in the fire of the Counter-Reformation when the printing press transformed books from a rarity into an everyday item, became the Church's shield against the growing wave of free thought. From Galileo's scientific treatises to Hugo's novels, thousands of books were banned for daring to question Catholic dogmas or simply to show the world as their authors saw it. Behind every forbidden page stood a struggle of ideas, a clash of world views, and often the personal dramas of authors whose works were declared heretical, immoral, or subversive. The history of the Index is a chronicle of the confrontation between free thought and institutional control, a reflection of the age-old dilemma between the desire to preserve the purity of faith and the irresistible human impulse to knowledge. The 16th century became a turning point in the history of European civilization. Christendom, which had remained unified for centuries, split under the onslaught of the Reformation. Martin Luther and his followers challenged papal authority, and Johann Gutenberg's invention of the printing press gave this movement an unprecedented opportunity to spread its ideas. For the first time in history, books ceased to be a rarity, accessible only to the chosen few. Now, thoughts deemed heretical by Rome could spread like wildfire, overcoming national and social boundaries. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Within a few weeks, printed copies of them were being read throughout Germany. The Catholic Church faced a threat it had never encountered before. If earlier heretics could be burned along with their manuscripts, now ideas became elusive. It was in this atmosphere of growing anxiety that the idea of systematic control over the printed word was born. The first lists of forbidden books appeared even before the creation of the official index. In 1543, in Paris, and then in Louvain and Venice, local theological faculties compiled lists of dangerous writings. But these measures were scattered and insufficient. A centralized approach was needed. The decisive step was taken by Pope Paul IV, Giovanni Pietro Carafa in the world. The former head of the Inquisition, he ascended the throne of St. Peter in 1555, when the Counter-Reformation was gaining momentum. Stern and unyielding, Paul IV was known for his uncompromising stance against any deviation from orthodoxy. Under his leadership, the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum was published in 1559. This document became the embodiment of his vision of the Church as an uncompromising fortress of faith. The first index was striking in its strictness, even by the standards of that time. It included not only Protestant literature but also many humanistic works, popular editions of the Bible in vernacular languages, and even some works by Catholic theologians that seemed insufficiently orthodox to the Pope. The structure of the first index was simple and effective. All forbidden books were divided into 3 classes. The first included works by authors whose all works were considered heretical. The second, individual forbidden writings by authors whose work in general was not rejected by the Church. The third class consisted of anonymous works deemed dangerous. This classification system, with minor changes, was maintained throughout the history of the index. The procedure for adding a book to the list was carefully regulated. First, a work came under suspicion by denunciation of a zealous Catholic by decision of a local bishop or by initiative of the congregation of the Index itself. Then, expert censors were appointed who carefully studied the text, noting all dubious passages. After this, the author could be offered to make corrections, and if he refused or was unavailable, the book was included in the Index. Behind the impressive facade of the Vatican, a meticulously calibrated mechanism of intellectual control operated for centuries. At the heart of this system was the Congregation of the Index, a special body created by Pope Pius V in 1571. This structure, composed of cardinals, theologians, and experts in canon law, was a veritable censorship factory of its time. The congregation met regularly, discussing new publications and deciding the fate of books that fell under suspicion. Its activities were closely linked to the Holy Inquisition, which could initiate the review of a particular work. Interestingly, until the 18th century, most censors were Dominicans, representatives of an order known for its theological rigor and adherence to tradition. The process of reviewing a book was multi-stage and could take from several months to several years. First, the work would go to primary censors, who compiled a detailed report, highlighting all questionable passages. These materials were then passed on to theological consultants for deeper analysis. Only after this did the matter reach the cardinals, who made the final decision. The criteria for evaluating works were enshrined in special rules, known as the 10 Rules of the Index, adopted at the Council of Trent. A book could be banned for heretical assertions contradicting church dogmas, for immoral content offensive to public morality, for criticism of the ecclesiastical hierarchy or papal authority, for promoting ideas that undermined public order. Even the style of presentation could lead to a ban. Excessive irony or satire directed at religious rites often sent a book straight to the Index. For authors, there was a possibility of avoiding a complete ban. The formula donec corrigatur, until corrected, meant that the book was temporarily banned until the necessary changes were made. Some writers compromised, while others preferred to preserve the integrity of their work at the cost of a ban. Punishments for those who dared to read or keep banned books were severe. The main sanction was excommunication, ipso facto, meaning automatically, without the need for a separate ecclesiastical decision. In an era when religion determined all aspects of social life, this meant social death. A person excommunicated from the church could not participate in sacraments, was deprived of the right to Christian burial, and risked ostracism in daily life. In countries with a strong inquisition such as Spain or Italy, violators also faced criminal prosecution. However, there was also a system of exceptions. For scholars, theologians, and other selected individuals, it was possible to obtain a special permit to read banned books. Such licenses were issued directly by the Vatican or by local bishops with appropriate authority. Obtaining such a permit was not easy. It required proving that reading banned literature was necessary for scientific or theological purposes, and not for idle curiosity. The permit holder had to keep banned books separate from the rest of the library, under lock and key, and prevent unauthorized access. Control over the distribution of banned books was exercised at various levels. Customs services in Catholic countries checked shipments of books crossing the border. Booksellers were obliged to have up-to-date copies of the Index and consult them. Bishops conducted regular inspections of libraries and bookstores. In universities, professors had to swear that they would not teach from banned books. The system was not perfect, but effective enough to significantly limit the spread of undesirable ideas in the Catholic world. Paradoxically, inclusion in the Index often led to the opposite effect. Banned books became objects of increased interest. They were secretly copied, smuggled across borders, hidden in double bindings. A whole underground industry of banned literature emerged, especially in France and the Netherlands, where books intended for illegal import into Catholic countries were printed. The conflict between science and the Church became one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Index of Forbidden Books. When, in 1543, the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus completed his work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, he did not merely propose a new astronomical model. He overturned the picture of the universe. Earth, for centuries considered the center of the universe, became an ordinary planet revolving around the sun. Copernicus, anticipating the storm, postponed publication until the last days of his life. The book was published when the scientist was already on his deathbed, sparing him the need to defend his ideas. Initially, the Church treated the heliocentric theory indulgently, as a purely mathematical hypothesis. But when, in the next century, Galileo Galilei began to provide observational evidence of Copernicus's correctness, the situation changed dramatically. In 1616, Copernicus's work was placed on the Index until corrected. This meant that the book could only be read after removing fragments asserting the reality of Earth's motion, and not just the convenience of such a mathematical model. Galileo's story became a symbol of the conflict between science and dogma. His Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems was written in Italian, not Latin, making scientific ideas accessible to the wider public. The book was a conversation between three characters, where the defender of the geocentric system, named Simplicio, simpleton, appeared unconvincing. Pope Urban VIII, recognizing himself in this character, was enraged. In 1633, the 70-year-old Galileo appeared before the Inquisition. Under threat of torture, he recanted his beliefs, uttering the famous phrase, "And yet it moves," probably only in his imagination. All his works were forbidden, and he himself spent the rest of his life under house arrest. René Descartes' works met a similar fate, although the French philosopher tried to avoid conflict with the Church. His method of radical doubt, expounded in Quote 4 and Quote 5, undermined the scholastic tradition based on the authority of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. Descartes proposed relying only on what could be known by reason, starting with the fact of one's own existence. I think, therefore, I am. In 1663, 13 years after the philosopher's death, his main writings were placed on the Index. These prohibitions had far-reaching consequences. In Protestant countries, where the influence of the Index was limited, the scientific revolution gained momentum. In the Catholic world, many scientists were forced to exercise caution, disguise their true views, or abandon publications altogether. Italian universities, which had been centers of scientific thought during the Renaissance, gradually lost their leadership, giving way to educational institutions in England, the Netherlands, and Protestant German states. The rift between science and religion deepened, forming the idea of their fundamental incompatibility, which largely persists to this day. Only in the 20th century did the Church begin to reevaluate its attitude towards past scientific discoveries. In 1992, Pope John Paul II officially acknowledged the error of Galileo's condemnation, and in 1984, a commission was established to study the case of the Italian astronomer. The 18th century went down in history as the Age of Enlightenment, a time when reason was proclaimed the supreme judge in all matters of existence. For the Catholic Church, This became a period of unprecedented intellectual challenges. Enlightenment philosophers did not merely question individual church practices. They rethought the very foundation of the religious worldview. It is no surprise that the index of prohibited books was augmented by dozens of works whose authors dared to place human reason above divine revelation. François-Marie Arouet, known to the world as Voltaire, became a true nightmare for Vatican censors. His sharp pen knew no mercy, and his irony struck down church dogmas more accurately than any theological treatise. Voltaire's quote, "zero," was added to the index in 1764, followed by other works of the philosopher. The Church was particularly outraged by his famous phrase, quote, "1," a call to fight religious fanaticism, which many interpreted as an attack on Christianity itself. Denis Diderot went even further. His monumental work, quote, "2," was not just a collection of knowledge, but a true manifesto of new thinking. Church authorities quickly recognized the danger. Under the guise of objective presentation of facts, Diderot and his co-authors promoted ideas that undermined the authority of the Church. The Encyclopédie was banned after the first volumes were published, but continued to be published underground. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who proposed the revolutionary concept of the social contract, also did not escape church censorship. His quote, "3" and quote, "4" were condemned not only by the Vatican, but also by the French authorities. Rousseau argued that man is born free, and that the state and the church only limit his natural rights. Such ideas were deemed subversive and dangerous. The works of Immanuel Kant caused particular alarm among church authorities. The German philosopher was not a radical critic of religion, but his concept of autonomous morality, independent of divine commandments, undermined the foundations of Christian ethics. Quote 5 and quote 6 were added to the index at the end of the 18th century. The Church could not accept the Kantian idea that moral law exists within man and is not given from above. What was it about the works of the Enlightenment thinkers that so frightened the Church? First and foremost, the idea of natural law, the notion that people are endowed from birth with inalienable rights that are granted neither by monarch nor by church. This undermined the traditional concept of power, supposedly given by God. No less dangerous was rationalism, the conviction that reason is capable of knowing truth without the aid of divine revelation. If man can independently distinguish good from evil, then why does he need priests and church dogmas? Finally, the Enlightenment thinkers openly criticized religious institutions, accusing them of corruption, obscurantism, and impeding progress. This criticism resonated with an increasingly educated public. However, bans often proved powerless against the ingenuity of authors and publishers. Many works were published anonymously or under pseudonyms. The practice of publishing books with false imprints became popular. The title page indicated a fictitious publisher in a Protestant country, although in reality, the book could have been printed in France or Italy. Some authors deliberately distorted their ideas, presenting them in Aesopian language, understandable only to initiated readers. Others resorted to artistic forms, the novel or dialogue, where controversial thoughts were put into the mouths of characters. Banned books were distributed through secret channels, by itinerant merchants, diplomats, students returning from foreign universities. In aristocratic salons, discussing such works became a sign of intellectual sophistication. Paradoxically, church censorship often contributed to the popularity of banned books. Inclusion in the index created a scandalous reputation for a book and aroused public curiosity. There is a famous story about how the publisher of Montesquieu's Persian Letters, learning of the book's ban, exclaimed, "Excellent! This will ensure the success of the second edition." Fiction has always occupied a special place in the system of church censorship. Unlike philosophical treatises or scientific works, novels and poems possess the ability to influence not only the mind, but also the feelings of the reader, subtly shaping their worldview through empathy with the characters. This is why the Vatican paid close attention to works that are now considered classics of world literature. Victor Hugo, Stendhal, Honoré de Balzac, Émile Zola. All these authors at various times found themselves under the scrutiny of church censorship. The criteria by which a work of art could be placed on the index were diverse. The most obvious reason was an anti-clerical orientation, open criticism of the church, satirical depiction of clergy, undermining the authority of religious institutions. However, often the reason for the ban was something less obvious. Too realistic a depiction of human passions, the absence of explicit moral condemnation of vice, or simply an independent view of society that did not coincide with church doctrine. Victor Hugo's novel, quote, Zero, became one of the most famous literary works included in the index. Published in 1862, this monumental work attracted the attention of censors not only for its criticism of social injustice, but also for its profound reinterpretation of Christian values. Bishop Myriel, one of the key characters in the novel, embodied true Christian mercy, sharply contrasting with the formal religiosity of the official church. The scene where the clergyman gives silver candlesticks to the escaped convict Jean Valjean was perceived as undermining the authority of the church. After all, Hugo showed that true holiness can exist outside the church hierarchy. No less problematic for the censors was the image of Fantine, a fallen woman depicted with deep sympathy. Hugo did not condemn her, but showed her as a victim of social hypocrisy, which contradicted the traditional church interpretation of sin and virtue. The novel was placed on the index in the same year it was published, and remained there until the last edition of the list in 1948. Stendhal's works also met with the disapproval of church authorities. The Red and the Black and The Charterhouse of Parma were banned for their critical depiction of the clerical environment and their psychologically accurate analysis of the ambitions tormenting the soul of Julien Sorel, a seminarian using a church career as a social ladder. Honoré de Balzac, although a conservative in his political views, did not escape church censorship. His realistic descriptions of human vices, especially greed and vanity, without explicit moral condemnation, seemed dangerous. Some novels from the human comedy cycle were included in the index for immorality and naturalism. Too truthful a depiction of life without embellishment. Émile Zola's naturalism caused particular dislike among censors. His _quote_6_ cycle presented man as a product of heredity and environment, virtually excluding free will and divine providence. The novel _quote_7_ depicting the life of a courtesan was immediately banned for _quote_8_. But the biggest scandal was caused by _quote_9_, a work in which Zola openly criticized the papacy and church policy. In many cases, the ban only contributed to the popularity of the work. Publishers often used the inclusion of a book in the index as an advertising ploy, printing on covers, quote, 10. In countries with strong anti-clerical sentiments, such as France in the Third Republic era, a church ban could even raise the author's prestige in the eyes of the progressive public. Paradoxically, Many works banned by the Church are now studied in Catholic educational institutions as masterpieces of world literature. Time has put everything in its place, showing that artistic truth often turns out to be closer to the spiritual values of Christianity than formal censorship, which sought to protect these values. The impact of the Index of Forbidden Books varied significantly across different parts of the Catholic world. The severity of censorship, methods of control, and even the effectiveness of the prohibitions themselves largely depended on the political climate, historical traditions, and relations between the Church and the state in each specific country. These geographical differences created a fascinating mosaic of censorship practices, reflecting the complexity of European cultural history. Spain and Italy were traditionally considered bastions of strict ecclesiastical censorship. In Spain, where the Inquisition wielded immense power, the Index was observed with particular diligence. Here, not only the Vatican version of the list of forbidden books was in effect, but also its own, Spanish Index, often even stricter than the Roman original. Booksellers were under constant surveillance, and violators faced severe penalties, from large fines to imprisonment. Public burnings of forbidden books were a common practice, designed to demonstrate the authorities' determination in combating heretical ideas. In Italy, especially in the Papal States, directly governed by the pontiff, control was no less stringent. Venice, being the largest publishing center, constantly balanced the commercial interests of its printing presses with the need to comply with ecclesiastical prohibitions. A special practice developed here. Many books were printed with double title pages, an official one for the censors and the real one, which was inserted later. A completely different situation emerged in France, where strong Gallican traditions, the desire for the independence of the French Church from Rome, created fertile ground for a more liberal attitude towards the Index. French Parlement, judicial bodies, often refused to recognize Roman prohibitions without prior approval from the royal authority. This led to a paradoxical situation. Many books forbidden in Rome circulated freely in Paris. Diderot and d'Alembert's famous Encyclopédie, included in the Index, continued to be published in France thanks to the patronage of influential figures, including Madame de Pompadour. In the Austrian Empire, the attitude towards the Index changed depending on the political course. Under Maria Theresa, censorship was quite strict, but her son, Emperor Joseph II, who pursued a policy of enlightened absolutism, significantly weakened ecclesiastical control over the printed word. His famous Patent of Toleration of 1781 effectively deprived the Church of its monopoly on censorship, transferring this function to state bodies. Poland presented another interesting case. Here, despite a deep Catholic tradition, gentry liberties and the relative weakness of central authority created space for intellectual freedom. Many forbidden books entered the country through Gdansk, which had a special status and close ties with Protestant lands. In the German territories, the situation was particularly complex due to political fragmentation. In Catholic principalities such as Bavaria, the Index was observed quite strictly. At the same time, the proximity of Protestant territories created a constant problem. Forbidden books easily penetrated across numerous borders. University towns, even in Catholic regions, often became islands of relative freedom of thought. Border regions, places where the Catholic world came into contact with Protestant or Orthodox, represented a special case. Here, peculiar gray zones formed, where ecclesiastical prohibitions lost their force. Flanders, Alsace, and some Swiss cantons became centers of illegal printing and distribution of forbidden literature. state power played a decisive role in determining the effectiveness of ecclesiastical censorship. In countries where the church and state acted in concert, as in Spain under Philip II, or in the Italian states, the index became a powerful tool of control. Where monarchs sought to limit Rome's influence, as in France or Austria in the 18th century, even formal recognition of the index did not guarantee its observance. Punishments for violating prohibitions also varied significantly. In Spain or the Papal States, a person caught reading or distributing forbidden books could face criminal prosecution. In France, such violations most often resulted only in ecclesiastical sanctions, not backed by state authority. The Age of Enlightenment and the subsequent revolutionary upheavals led to a further erosion of the index's influence. By the 19th century, even in traditionally Catholic countries, its observance became increasingly formal. State censorship, guided by political rather than religious considerations, gradually supplanted ecclesiastical censorship. Nevertheless, in some regions, especially in the rural areas of Spain, Italy, and Poland, where the influence of the clergy remained strong, the index continued to shape reading habits well into the 20th century. The geographical differences in the application of the index clearly demonstrate how complex and multifaceted the interaction between ecclesiastical doctrine and socio-political reality was in different parts of the Catholic world. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought new challenges to the Vatican, unprecedented in their scale. The Industrial Revolution changed not only the economy, but also public consciousness. Secularization permeated all spheres of life, and scientific discoveries undermined the traditional worldview. The Church, which for centuries had defined Europe's intellectual landscape, found itself on the defensive, and the index of forbidden books became one of the main tools in this struggle for the minds of believers. New intellectual currents caused particular alarm in the Vatican. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, struck a blow to the biblical narrative of creation. The Origin of Species was not formally included in the index, but many works popularizing Darwinism were banned. The Church could not accept the idea that man evolved from ape-like ancestors rather than being created in the image and likeness of God. Marxism posed no less a threat. Karl Marx proclaimed religion the opiate of the people and predicted its disappearance in a future communist society. Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto were included in the index as undermining not only church doctrine, but also the social order itself, which the Church considered divinely ordained. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis brought new headaches to the Vatican. His theories of subconscious sexual desires, childhood sexuality, and the Oedipus complex seemed offensive to Christian morality. Freud's works were banned, and his ideas were condemned as destructive to family values and human dignity. Existentialism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility, also aroused suspicion. The works of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir found their way into the index, as they questioned traditional religious notions of predestination. Particularly dangerous for the Church was the movement known as modernism. Its proponents sought to reconcile Catholic doctrine with modern science and philosophy, allowing for a historical, critical approach to the Bible and a rethinking of certain dogmas in the light of new knowledge. Pope Pius X saw modernism not merely as another heresy, but as the synthesis of all heresies. In 1907, he issued the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, in which he subjected modernism to devastating criticism. The document condemned attempts to interpret religious truths as symbols subject to historical development, and insisted on their immutability. The encyclical was followed by a tightening of censorship. The list of forbidden books was expanded, and Catholic teachers and priests were required to take an anti-modernist oath. Many theologians suspected of sympathy for modernism lost their chairs and the right to publish their works. Among the victims of this campaign was Alfred Loisy, a French priest and biblical scholar whose works on the historical critical analysis of sacred scripture were included in the Index. Loisy was excommunicated in 1908. The Vatican's reaction to the intellectual challenges of modernity was not limited to prohibitions. The Church sought to offer an alternative, a quote, "Seven Catholic philosophy and science." In 1879, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris proclaimed Neothemism, the revival of Thomas Aquinas's philosophy, as the official philosophical doctrine of Catholicism. This was intended to create an intellectual basis for confronting modern quote, _9 _. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of the Index in the era of mass printing became increasingly questionable. While in the 16th century the Church could control a relatively small number of printing houses, in the 19th and 20th centuries this became virtually impossible. The circulation of newspapers and books grew, and their cost decreased, making the printed word accessible to wide segments of the population. States, even nominally Catholic, increasingly less supported church censorship. After the unification of Italy in 1871, the Papal States were reduced to the territory of the Vatican, and the Church lost the secular power necessary for effective control over the press. In France, anti-clerical sentiments, especially strong during the Third Republic, led to a complete disregard for the Index. Even in traditionally Catholic countries, such as Spain and Portugal, the influence of the prohibitions gradually weakened. The First World War and the subsequent social upheavals further undermined the authority of traditional institutions, including the Church. In these circumstances, the Index was increasingly perceived as an anachronism, out of step with the realities of the 20th century. Nevertheless, it continued to be updated. The last edition was published in 1948 and included about 4,000 forbidden works. Only the Second Vatican Council, which opened in 1962, marked a decisive turn towards dialogue with the modern world and the recognition of believers' right to freedom of conscience. The 400-year era of official church censorship was coming to an end. By the mid-20th century, it became evident that the 400-year history of the Index of Forbidden Books was approaching its logical conclusion. The world had changed dramatically. 2 world wars, the Cold War, decolonization, the technological revolution, all these created a reality in which a medieval tool of thought control seemed an anachronism. The Catholic Church, which had resisted change for centuries, began to realize the necessity of dialogue with the modern world. The first signs of liberalization appeared under Pope Pius XII. In 1952, he reformed the procedures of the Holy Office, the former Inquisition, softening some aspects of censorship. However, the real turning point occurred with the election of Pope John XXIII in 1958. This elderly pontiff, whom many considered a temporary figure, unexpectedly initiated revolutionary changes in the Church. Just 3 months after his election, John XXIII announced the convocation of the Second Vatican Council, the first in almost 100 years. "We need to open the windows of the Church to let in fresh air." These words of the Pope became a symbol of a new era. The Council opened on October 11, 1962, in the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica. More than 2,000 bishops from around the world gathered to rethink the place of Catholicism in modern society. The question of freedom of conscience and intellectual freedom became one of the central issues at the Council. Many progressive theologians, who had recently been under suspicion, now actively participated in the discussions. Among them were Yves Congar, Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, thinkers whose ideas had previously aroused Vatican caution. During the discussions, it became increasingly clear that the Index of Forbidden Books did not correspond to the new understanding of the relationship between the Church and the faithful. The traditional model, based on prohibitions and punishments, was giving way to the concept of personal responsibility and mature faith. The Church recognized that adult Christians were capable of independently evaluating ideas and literary works in the light of their faith. After the death of John XXIII in June 1963, his successor Paul VI continued the reforms. In December 1965, the Council adopted the Declaration, quote, 1, on religious freedom, which recognized the right of every person to freedom of conscience. This document effectively undermined the philosophical foundations of the Index. The decisive moment came on December 7, 1965, with the adoption of the decree, quote, 2, on the means of social communication. It emphasized the importance of freedom of information and creativity, albeit with the caveat of the need to observe moral norms. The formal abolition of the Index occurred on June 14, 1966. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, head of the Holy Office, renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, signed the decree, quote, 3. The document declared that the Index no longer had the force of ecclesiastical law and did not entail excommunication. It was emphasized, however, that the moral obligation of Catholics to avoid literature harmful to faith remained. The irony of fate was that Ottaviani, a conservative and hardliner, was the man who signed the death warrant of a 400-year-old system of censorship. He did so without enthusiasm, obeying the decision of the Council and the Pope. The international community's reaction to the abolition of the Index was predominantly positive. Intellectuals welcomed the Vatican's decision as a sign of openness and willingness to dialogue. The liberal press viewed it as a victory for freedom of thought. Even in secular circles, many noted the historical significance of the moment. Within the Catholic community itself, the reaction was mixed. Progressive Catholics received the news with enthusiasm, seeing it as confirmation of the course towards renewal. The conservative wing, on the other hand, expressed fears that the abandonment of traditional forms of control would lead to an erosion of faith and morals. It should be noted that the abolition of the Index did not mean the complete abandonment by the Church of evaluating literature and ideas. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith retained the right to make judgments about the conformity of certain works with Catholic teaching. However, these evaluations were now advisory, not prohibitive, and were not accompanied by the threat of excommunication. 400 years of ecclesiastical censorship ended not with a loud scandal, but with a quiet recognition of changed realities. The era when faith needed protection through prohibitions gave way to a time when it had to prove its viability in an open competition of ideas. The books of Galileo, Descartes, Voltaire, Kant, Hugo, all those works that the Church had considered dangerous for centuries, could now be freely read by Catholics without fear of excommunication. 400 years of prohibitions and restrictions left a deep mark on European culture. The Index of Prohibited Books, conceived as a shield of faith, eventually transformed into a monument to intellectual struggle in which the ultimate victors were the authors whose works they tried to consign to oblivion. Paradoxically, many works owe their fame precisely to ecclesiastical bans. As an 18th-century French publisher remarked, "There is no better advertisement for a book than its condemnation by the Vatican." History has preserved many anecdotes about how writers and philosophers literally dreamed of seeing their works in the Index, rightly believing that this would guarantee them reader interest and a place in history. Voltaire, upon learning of the ban on his writings, ironically remarked, "What an honor! I am finally in good company with Descartes and Montaigne." The forbidden fruit effect worked flawlessly. The stricter the prohibition, the stronger the temptation. In some aristocratic circles, the presence of a secret library with forbidden editions became a sign of sophistication and intellectual independence. Book smuggling turned into a profitable business, and booksellers developed a whole arsenal of tricks to circumvent censorship, from fake covers to hidden compartments in bindings. The influence of the Index on the development of science and philosophy was contradictory. On the one hand, prohibitions undoubtedly slowed the spread of new ideas in Catholic countries. Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese universities, once centers of European intellectual life, gradually yielded leadership to educational institutions in Protestant states. On the other hand, the need to overcome censorship barriers stimulated the development of critical thinking and inventiveness. Authors learned to express revolutionary ideas in Aesopian language, to use irony and allegories, to create multi-layered texts in which a subversive subtext was hidden behind seemingly innocuous content. The struggle against ecclesiastical censorship itself contributed to the formation of the concept of freedom of speech as a fundamental human right. It is no coincidence that the first theoretical justifications for freedom of the press appeared precisely in response to the repressive measures of the Church and state. John Milton's Areopagitica, a passionate defense of freedom of the press, was written in the 17th century as a reaction to censorship restrictions. Voltaire, whose works were repeatedly banned, formulated a principle that became classic. "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." The history of the Index also demonstrates how complex and ambiguous the interaction between religion and culture can be. The Church, striving to protect believers from harmful ideas, sometimes banned works that were later recognized as masterpieces of world literature, and even sources of spiritual inspiration. Victor Hugo's Les Misérables, which remained in the Index until its abolition, is today considered by many Catholic theologians to be a profoundly Christian work, revealing themes of redemption and mercy. This paradox forces us to ponder the limits of institutional control over culture and the ability of great works to overcome any barriers. The abolition of the Index in 1966 was an acknowledgement that faith must withstand the test of free thought, rather than hide behind a wall of prohibitions. This decision reflected a deeper understanding that true religiosity is based on personal choice and conviction, not on fear of punishment. However, the end of official ecclesiastical censorship did not mean the end of attempts to control information and ideas. In the modern world, this trend has taken on new, sometimes more sophisticated forms. The digital age has brought unprecedented freedom of information dissemination, but at the same time, created new mechanisms of control. Social media algorithms that determine what content we see, state internet filtering systems, laws on fake news and offending the feelings of believers. All of these can be seen as modern analogues of the Index. Even in democratic societies, debates continue about the boundaries of what is permissible in the public sphere. Where does freedom of speech end and hate speech begin? Should there be restrictions on the dissemination of ideas that the majority considers dangerous or offensive? These questions do not have simple answers, and the history of the Index of Prohibited Books can serve as an important lesson in these discussions. It reminds us of the danger of institutional control over thought, of the inevitable conflict between the desire for stability and the need for intellectual development, of the paradoxical consequences of censorship, which often achieves results contrary to those intended. Today, when many once forbidden books have become classics of world literature and philosophy, studied in schools and universities, the history of the Index seems like a distant past. But the impulse to control ideas, the desire to protect society from dangerous thoughts, remain part of human nature. Perhaps the main lesson of the 400-year history of the Index of Prohibited Books is that truly valuable ideas cannot be destroyed by prohibitions. They find their way to people's minds and hearts despite any barriers, overcoming the boundaries of space and time. Ultimately, it is freedom of thought and speech that proves to be the most stable and fruitful basis for the development of human culture.